Good morning. I'm going to call this hearing to order and welcome to our witnesses, Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, CIA Director Bill Burns, FBI Director Chris Wray, Director of National Security Agency and Commander of U.S. Cybercom, General Paul Nakasone, and DIA Director Lieutenant General Scott Berrier. Thank you all for coming before the committee today to discuss the intelligence community's annual worldwide threat assessment. This is an opportunity for agencies to brief this oversight committee and, most importantly, the American public about the numerous threats and challenges facing our country. Our nation's intelligence professionals are America's eyes and ears. They provide crucial intelligence assessments and warnings to policymakers so that we might address not just immediate threats, but dangers on the horizon. I'd like to thank you and, importantly, the thousands of men and women of America's intelligence community whom you represent for their quiet, unsung, and often unacknowledged service. I think we all know, and we see this on a daily basis, we live in an increasingly challenging and complex world. While the ongoing war in Ukraine has shown that conventional military capabilities are still important, I think the very nature of national security is undergoing a profound transformation. National security in 2023 is not the same as it was in 1993, for that matter, in 2003. We can no longer just pay attention to who has the most tanks, airplanes, or missiles. We also need to focus on technology, R&D dollars, strategic investment flows, and supply chains, because whoever leads and wins the challenges in technology domains will have an edge in national security competition in the future. We've already seen this with the outsized impact of cyber tools, which now give both state and non-state actors alike the power to cripple countries' critical infrastructure and entire economies from behind a keyboard without firing a single shot. And we're increasingly seeing rising competition in the technology space with authoritarian regimes that are challenging democratic norms at home and around the world. The People's Republic of China under President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party is now, unfortunately, a near-peer competitor with our country in its economy, technology, and military capabilities. And I think it is more important than just political correctness to emphasize, at least in my mind, our beef is with Xi Jinping, the Communist Party, and their authoritarian tendencies. It is not with the Chinese people, it is not with the Chinese diaspora, it is not with Chinese Americans or Asian Americans, who oftentimes have been the strongest critics of the increasingly authoritarian regime of the Xi government and are often victims themselves of CCP's repression. While America was focused for 2 decades on counterterrorism, China was racing to overtake the United States in a range of emerging and foundational technologies, such as advanced wireless communications, semiconductors, quantum, synthetic biology, and next-generation energy, as well as taking not only the extraction, but the processing of rare earth minerals that are so critical in so many of those technologies. The PRC has also become an active player in the international technology standard-setting bodies and is embedding itself in global supply chains. All of this is why the United States must aggressively invest in talents, tools, and research to lead in tomorrow's technologies. Today, you will undoubtedly be asked about the IC's assessment on the origins of COVID-19. Let's be clear. Despite China's denials, it is entirely fair for us to ask whether the virus that has killed at least 6.8 million people so far might have been accidentally released from a lab in Wuhan. That these questions are even necessary is a testament to the failings of the Chinese system and stands in contrast to the openness of our own public health officials during the pandemic. The lack of transparency in China's authoritarian systems may mean that we will never be absolutely certain where COVID-19, or God forbid, the next pandemic, could have or will next originate. Looking towards Russia, we are now in the 2nd year of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The IC, and I'm going to commend so many of you, did an incredible job of predicting Putin's plans and issuing warnings about the invasion, declassifying and sharing intelligence in a timely way, and I know for many of you that was totally against your grain, but making that declassification in a timely way, I really think upended Russia's plans and kept Putin off his game. Over the last years, Ukrainians have displayed resolve, bravery, resourcefulness as they have defended their country against Russia's ruthless invasion. NATO is more united than ever, and democracies around the world have rallied with unprecedented assistance to Ukraine in training, intelligence sharing, humanitarian, and modern military equipment. I hope that we'll hear from the IC assessment of the trajectory of this bloody conflict and what we think the end game will be, while at the same time obviously maintaining Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation. I'm sure that we will discuss the multitude of other threats, from rogue states like Iran and North Korea, to emerging global health threats, to the threat of global warming, as well as the threats presented to the IC's workforce by anomalous health incidents, or AHIs. All of your agencies rely on world-class talent of your workforce, and that's why this committee will continue our efforts to ensure on federal clearance reform, security clearance reform. Hiring and retention is so important to make sure we maintain that world-class workforce. Last thing to note, and I think I speak for everyone on both sides of the aisle on this committee. We still have unfinished business regarding the classified documents that we need to see in order for this intelligence committee to effectively oversee its job on intelligence oversights. We must resolve this issue soon. The challenges we face are more varied and dynamic than ever, and clearly you all have your hands full. But we also have, I think in this hearing, particularly for the public part, a chance to underscore conviction in our values and our efforts to reinvigorate our allies around the world, and to be clear-eyed about the threats that authoritarian regimes like China and Russia place. So I look forward to today's discussion, and with that, I'll turn it over to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming in here today. You know, for 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, our country, the United States, was the world's sole superpower. And that gave us the luxury to hope for a world in which Russia and China were coming into convergence with the values that, of the free world. And I think also gave us the luxury of entertaining this fantasy that somehow free trade and globalizing the economy would produce peace, prosperity, and prevent nation-state rivalry. And that brief period of time between the end of the Cold War and very recently was a historic anomaly. The truth is that if you look at 500 years of geopolitics, it's been defined by great power competition. And that's where we find ourselves once again. It's clear there's not going to be any convergence of values. It's clear that globalization led to the rise of China, but it also deindustrialized America, created long and vulnerable supply chains. It eroded our middle class. It left our society deeply divided along socioeconomic lines. And we now find ourselves in a new world. One divided between the free nations, led still by America, an authoritarian and tyrannical bloc led by Beijing, and then dozens and dozens of developing countries that are leveraging both sides against each other on issue after issue to cut the best deal for themselves. So today, what we gather here, as we do once a year, to discuss the worldwide threats facing our country. And those threats, there are no shortage of them. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, global terrorism, narco-terrorists operating just right off and across our border and even in the homeland. All these are very serious threats. But it is my view that the greatest threat facing America is not another country. It is whether or not we have the ability and the willingness to accurately assess and appropriately adapt our foreign and domestic policies in this time of historic, revolutionary, and disruptive technological, social, economic, and geopolitical changes. The answer to that question is not just going to determine the direction of our country. The answer to that question will define the 21st century. And on this matter, I believe that the intelligence community has a critical and vital role to play. First, because the changes we must make will have to overcome complacency, bureaucratic resistance, opposition from interest groups who benefit from the status quo, and frankly, public discomfort with the consequences of some of the changes we're going to need to make. Complacency because we've relied on our power advantages and we've forgotten what it's like to live in a world where we have near-peer competitors. Bureaucratic resistance because our government, frankly, the commentary class, think tanks, academia, to some extent even Congress, is still filled with officials who came of age in the post-Cold War fantasy about the end of history. Opposition from powerful interests because multinational corporations that dominate and have consolidated some of our most important industries are deeply invested in foreign supply chains and in the current state of the global economy. And public discomfort, frankly, because we've become a society addicted to cheap products from China and viral videos on TikTok. Overcoming all this will only be possible if we can motivate policymakers and convince our citizens of the need to act on at least 5 distinct areas of great power competition and potentially great power conflict. It's a military competition, one in which we can no longer rely on overwhelming advantages to deliver relatively quick success. It's a diplomatic and political competition for influence in multilateral institutions and over important and entering into and maintaining important international alliances. It's an economic and industrial competition over critical industries, supply chains, access to resources, the flow of capital. It's a scientific and technological competition on areas ranging from precision medicine, artificial intelligence, cyber, the digital economy, quantum computing, control over valuable personal data, and protecting innovation and intellectual property. And it's an informational competition involving closed and controlled societies dedicated to using our openness to divide us against each other here at home and drive disinformation to further their narrative and undermine our standing in the world. In the 21st century, providing policymakers information on these areas of competition and understanding how they intersect with one another is a vital and critical national priority. And only our intelligence agencies have the resources and the broad-based insight needed to provide this. Intelligence work today is not just about collecting state secrets and protecting our own. It is now also increasingly about the important analysis of what all of these factors mean tied together, so that we, as policymakers, can decide what matters and what doesn't, so that we can prioritize the urgent over the important. Getting this wrong is the single greatest threat facing our country, and getting it right, the single most important task we have at hand. So I hope we can hear in this open setting how each of the agencies represented here today is adjusting to this historic challenge, because we simply have no time to waste. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. For members and audience, the run of show this morning is we're going to have an open session now. We are going to work through the votes this morning, and we will, Vice Chairman and I will take turns getting out to vote. We will go immediately into a closed session, and we'll kind of bring lunch along the way. We want to make sure we take advantage of as much time as needed with our distinguished panel. And unlike, although we've got great attendance at the gavel, we are going to go by seniority today, just because I know a lot of members have got other committee meetings as well this morning. With that, I think, Director Haines, are you going to start us off?
Yes, Chairman, I'll deliver the statement for the group in a sense. Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today alongside my wonderful colleagues on behalf of the extraordinary public servants we lead in the intelligence community to present the IC's annual threat assessment. Before I start, I just want to publicly thank the men and women of the intelligence community whose work we're presenting today. From the collector to the analyst and everybody in between, who made it possible for us to bring you the annual threat assessment in hopes that this work will help keep our country safe and prosperous. Thank you. This year's assessment notes that during the coming year, the United States and its allies will face an international security environment dominated by 2 sets of strategic challenges that intersect with each other and existing trends to intensify their national security implications. First, great powers, rising regional powers, and an evolving array of non-state actors are vying for influence and impact in the international system, including over the standards and rules that will shape the global order for decades to come. The next few years are critical as strategic competition with China and Russia intensifies, in particular over how the world will evolve and whether the rise of authoritarianism can be checked and reversed. Other threats are, of course, also individually significant, but how well we stay ahead of and manage this competition will be fundamental to our success at navigating everything else. Second, challenges that transcend borders, including climate change, human and health security, and economic needs made worse by energy and food security, as well as Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine, are converging as the planet emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic, and all at the same time as great powers are challenging long-standing norms for transnational cooperation. And further compounding this dynamic is the impact that rapidly emerging technologies are having on governance, business, society, and intelligence around the world. And given that background, perhaps needless to say, the People's Republic of China, which is increasingly challenging the United States economically, technologically, politically, and militarily around the world, remains our unparalleled priority. Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under President Xi Jinping, will continue efforts to achieve Xi's vision of making China the preeminent power in East Asia and a major power on the world stage. To fulfill Xi's vision, however, the CCP is increasingly convinced that it can only do so at the expense of U.S. power and influence, and by using coordinated whole-of-government tools to demonstrate strength and compel neighbors to acquiesce to its preferences, including its land, sea, and air claims in the region and its assertions of sovereignty over Taiwan. Last October, President Xi secured his third five-year term as China's leader at the 20th Party Congress. And as we meet today, China's national legislature is in session, formally appointing Xi and confirming his choice to lead the PRC's State Council, as well as its ministries and the leaders of the military, legislature, and judicial branches. And after more than a decade of serving as China's top leader, Xi's control over key levers of power gives him significant power and influence over most issues. Xi has surrounded himself with like-minded loyalists at the apex of the party's standing committee, China's highest decision-making body, and we assess that during the course of Xi's third term, they will together attempt to press Taiwan on unification, undercut U.S. influence, which they perceive as a threat, and drive wedges between Washington and its allies and partners, and promote certain norms that favor China's authoritarian system. And you may have seen Xi's recent criticism during his speech on Monday of what he referred to as America's suppression of China, reflecting his longstanding distrust of U.S. goals and his apparent belief that the United States seeks to, quote-unquote, contain China. And Xi's speech this week was the most public and direct criticism that we've seen from him to date, and probably reflects growing pessimism in Beijing about China's relationship with the United States, as well as Xi's growing worries about the trajectory of China's domestic economic development and indigenous technology innovation, challenges that he now blames on the United States. He also wants to message his populist and regional actors that the U.S. bears the responsibility for any coming increase in tensions. And despite this more public and directly critical rhetoric, however, we assess that Beijing still believes it benefits most by preventing a spiraling of tensions and by preserving stability in its relationship with the United States. And specifically, Beijing wants to preserve stability in East Asia, avoid triggering additional economic punishments from U.S. sanctions and U.S. partners, and showcase a steady relationship with the United States to help avoid setbacks in its other relationships around the world, even while signaling opposition to claimed U.S. provocations, including the shoot-down of the PRC balloon. He wants a period of relative calm to give China the time and stability it needs to address growing domestic difficulties. And Xi's principal focus is on domestic economic development, which is not assured. In fact, the IC assesses that China's long-term economic growth will continue to decelerate because China's era of rapid catch-up growth is ending, and structural issues such as debt, demographics, inequality, over-reliance on investment, and suppressed consumption remain. And although the CCP may find ways to overcome its structural challenges over the long term, in the short term, the CCP continues to take an increasingly aggressive approach to external affairs, pursuing its goal of building a world-class military, expanding its nuclear arsenal, pursuing counter-space weapons capable of targeting U.S. and allied satellites, forcing foreign companies and coercing foreign countries to allow the transfer of technology and intellectual property in order to boost its indigenous capabilities, continuing to increase global supply chain dependencies on China with the aim of using such technologies and dependencies, rather, to threaten and cut off foreign countries during a crisis, expanding the cyber pursuits and increasing the threat of aggressive cyber operations against the U.S. homeland and foreign partners, and expanding influence operations, including through the export of digital repression technologies. And the CCP will also seek to reshape global governance in line with his preferences and governance standards that support its monopoly of power within China. Beijing is elevating PRC candidates and policies at the UN, attempting to gain buy-in for Xi's development and global initiatives, promotes blocs like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a counterweight to the West, and shape multilateral groupings such as the formerly 17+1 Forum in Eastern Europe, but with mixed success. In brief, the CCP represents both the leading and most consequential threat to U.S. national security and leadership globally, and its intelligence-specific ambitions and capabilities make it, for us, our most serious and consequential intelligence rival. During the past year, the threat has been additionally complicated by a deepening collaboration with Russia, which also remains an area, obviously, of intense focus for the intelligence community. In fact, we were last here for our ATA hearing last year. It was only a few weeks after Russia's unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine. And now we are over a year into the war, which is reshaping not only Russia's global relationships and strategic standing, but also our own, strengthening our alliances and partnerships in ways that President Putin almost certainly did not anticipate, often precipitating the very events that he was trying to avoid, such as Sweden and Finland's petition to join NATO. And on the battlefield, there is currently a grinding attritional war in which neither side has a definitive military advantage. And the day-to-day fighting is over hundreds of meters, currently focused largely in Donetsk, as Russia tries to capture the remainder of the oblast. The Russians are making incremental progress on Bakhmut, which is not a particularly strategic objective, but are otherwise facing considerable constraints, including personnel and ammunition shortages, dysfunction within the military's leadership, exhaustion, as well as morale challenges. And even as the Russian offensive continues, they are experiencing high casualty rates. Putin is likely better understanding the limits of what his military is capable of achieving and appears to be focused on more modest military objectives for now. Export controls and sanctions are hampering Russia's war effort, particularly by restricting access to foreign components necessary to produce weapon systems. And if Russia does not initiate a mandatory mobilization and identify substantial third-party ammunition supplies, it will be increasingly challenging for them to sustain even the current level of offensive operations in the coming months, and consequently, they may fully shift to holding and defending the territories they now occupy. In short, we do not foresee the Russian military recovering enough this year to make major territorial gains, but Putin most likely calculates that time works in his favor and that prolonging the war, including with potential pauses in the fighting, may be his best remaining pathway to eventually securing Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine, even if it takes years. And Ukraine, of course, also faces challenges. Ukraine's prospects for success in a major spring offensive will probably hinge on a number of factors. And at present, the Ukrainian armed forces remain locked in a struggle to defend against Russian offenses across eastern Ukraine. And while these Russian assaults are costly for Russia, the extent to which Ukrainian forces are having to draw down their reserves and equipment, as well as suffer further casualties, will all likely factor into Ukraine's ability to go on the offensive later this spring. And the IC continues to monitor Putin's reactions and his nuclear saber rattling. Our analysts assess that his current posturing is intended to deter the West from providing additional support to Ukraine as he weighs a further escalation of the conflict. He probably will still remain confident that Russia can eventually militarily defeat Ukraine and wants to prevent Western support from tipping the balance and forcing a conflict with NATO. And of course, the already considerable human toll of the conflict is only increasing. In addition to the many tens of thousands casualties suffered by the Russians and Ukrainian militaries, more than 8 million people have been forced to flee Ukraine since Russia invaded. And there is widespread reporting of atrocities committed by Russian forces, including deliberate strikes against non-military targets, such as Ukraine's civilian population and civilian infrastructure, particularly its energy facilities and electric grid. Russia and its proxy groups almost certainly are using so-called filtration operations to detain and forcibly deport tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians to Russia. The IC is engaged with other parts of the U.S. government to document and hold Russia and Russian actors accountable for their actions. The reaction to the invasion from countries around the world has been resolute, hurting Russia's reputation and generating criticism at home. And Moscow has suffered losses that will require years of rebuilding and leave it less capable of posing a conventional military threat to Europe and operating assertively in Eurasia and on the global stage. And as a result, Russia will become even more reliant on asymmetric options, such as nuclear, cyber, space capabilities, and on China. And our assessment also covers Iran, which continues to pursue its long-standing ambitions for regional leadership and is a threat to U.S. persons directly and via proxy attacks. Iran also remains a threat to Israel, both directly through its missile and UAV forces and indirectly through its support of Lebanese Hezbollah and other proxies. And most concerning, Iran has accelerated the expansion of its nuclear program, stating that it is no longer constrained by JCPOA limits and has undertaken research and development activities that would bring it closer to producing the fissile material necessary for completing a nuclear device following a decision to do so. North Korea similarly remains a proliferation concern as it continues its efforts to steadily expand and enhance its nuclear and conventional capabilities, targeting the United States and our allies, periodically using aggressive and potentially destabilizing actions to reshape the regional security environment in its favor and to reinforce its status as a de facto nuclear power. And in addition, regional challenges such as interstate conflicts, key cases of instability, and poor governance developments also pose growing challenges. In Africa and in the developing world, increased poverty, hindered economic growth, and widened inequality are creating the conditions that are feeding domestic unrest, insurgencies, democratic backsliding, authoritarianism, and cross-border conflict spillover. And several parts of the Middle East will remain plagued by war over the year, insurgencies, and corruption. In the Western Hemisphere, persistent economic weakness, insecurity, and corruption are fueling public frustration and anti-status quo pressures that very likely will present governance challenges to leaders while also posing sustained spillover migration, criminal, and economic challenges for the United States. And throughout the world, countries are struggling to maintain democratic systems and prevent the rise of authoritarians, in some cases because Russia and China are helping autocrats take or hold power. And as I noted at the outset, transnational challenges interact in this complex system along with more traditional threats and often reinforce each other, creating compounding and cascading risks to U.S. national security. For example, climate change remains an urgent threat that will increasingly exacerbate risks to U.S. national security as the physical impacts increase and geopolitical tensions mount over the global response to the challenge. And now entering its fourth year, the COVID-19 pandemic remains one of the most significant threats to global public health at a cost of more than 6.5 million lives and trillions of dollars in lost economic output to date. In addition to direct effects of the pandemic result in economic, human security, political, national security implications of COVID-19 continue to strain recovery efforts, presenting both known and unforeseen challenges that probably will ripple through society and the global economy during the next year and for years to come. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has aggravated COVID-19 related fragilities in the global economy, raised commodity prices, fueled market volatility, and contributed to food insecurity and financial instability. And the combination of elevated energy and food prices has increased the number of individuals facing extreme poverty and food insecurity. Affected countries will struggle to reverse those trends through 2023, even if global food prices stabilize. And Russia's war in Ukraine can be blamed for this intensifying effects, something much of the world also understands and that others, including China, will have to come to terms with as they consider to what extent they want to continue assisting or enabling Russia. And climate change, the pandemic, and conflicts are exacerbating irregular migration, and in the Western Hemisphere, push and pull factors that drive migrants to the United States, such as deteriorating socioeconomic and security conditions, misperceptions of U.S. policies, and employment opportunities in the United States will almost certainly persist through 2023. Transnational criminal organizations exploit migrants through extortion, kidnapping, and human trafficking, including sex trafficking and forced labor. These organizations also continue to pose a direct threat through the production and trafficking of lethal illicit drugs, massive theft, financial and cyber crimes, money laundering, eroding the rule of law in partner nations. And in particular, the threat from illicit drugs is at historic levels, with the robust supply of synthetic opioids from Mexican TCOs continuing to play a major role in driving American overdose deaths to over 100,000 annually. And terrorism, of course, remains a persistent threat, but the problem is evolving. Individuals and cells adhering to ideologies espoused by ISIS, al-Qaeda, and transnational racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist movements in particular pose significant threats to U.S. persons, facilities, and interests. And then two indirect threats that I think are worth highlighting in the report. New technologies, particularly in the field of AI and biotechnologies, are being developed and proliferating faster than companies and governments are able to shape norms governing their use, protect against privacy challenges associated with them, and prevent dangerous outcomes that they can trigger. The convergence of emerging technologies is likely to create breakthroughs that are not as predictable and that risk a rapid development of more interconnected, asymmetric threats to U.S. interests. And relatedly, foreign states' malicious use of digital information and communication technologies will become more pervasive, automated, targeted, and complex during the next few years, threatening to distort publicly available information and probably outpacing efforts to protect digital freedoms and at the same time educate audiences on how to distinguish fact from propaganda. Authoritarian governments usually are the principal offenders of digital repression, and of course, democracies with open information environments are the most vulnerable to them. In closing, I want to bring to your attention an absolutely crucial authority that will expire at the end of this year if Congress does not act. Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I can tell you without hesitation that Section 702 was relied upon in gathering intelligence that was relevant to putting together this assessment, and as it is hard to overestimate, frankly, the importance of this authority to our work across the board. FISA Section 702 provides unique intelligence on foreign intelligence targets at a speed and reliability that we cannot replicate with any other authority. And Section 702 was originally enacted with the primary focus of enabling the U.S. government to quickly collect on the communications of terrorists abroad. The authority allows the IC to require foreign intelligence from non-U.S. people located outside of the United States who are using U.S. electronic communication service providers. 702 is still vital to our counterterrorism mission, as evidenced by its key role in the United States government's operations against former al-Qaeda Ayman al-Zawahiri, but 702 is now principally relied upon for vital insights across a range of high-priority threats. Malicious cyber actors targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, U.S. government efforts to stop components of weapons of mass destruction from reaching foreign actors, and even key intelligence related to threats emanating from China, Russia, North Korea, Iran. I realize that 702 is a powerful authority, and it is incumbent on all of us in the intelligence community to ensure that the privacy and civil liberty interests of Americans are built into its design and implemented at every level. And over the last many years, we have significantly expanded oversight, dedicated resource to compliance in order to do just that, and we welcome the opportunity to work with you on reauthorizing this critical authority. Thank you so much for your patience, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Haines. And again, this is a critically important time for not only those of us on the committee, but the public at large to see the intelligence community leadership. I personally believe the value of 702, but we're going to have to lean in on being willing to have the same kind of courage of declassification that we showed in advance of Putin's invasion of Ukraine to make the case to the American public, and for that matter, to skeptical members of Congress in terms of how this is not simply used as an anti-terrorism tool, but also in terms of our competition with Russia and China. I'm going to take my time and come back to the question the changing nature of national security. I made comments that national security today is different than it was in 1993 or 2003. At that moment in time, perhaps relatively simpler times, we looked at our adversaries in terms of how many tanks and planes and guns they might have. Increasingly, I believe, and I think the vast majority of us on this committee believe, the competition falls into who wins various technology domains. General Nakasone and I were talking before the session today about how then Chairman Burr and I were trying to make the case that Huawei posed a national security threat to American telecom providers and others. It took us years to make that case, and we are still recovering from that activity. I think about more recently, Senator Cornyn and I and others on this committee recognized that we'd fallen far behind in the research, development, and fabrication, the making of semiconductor chips. And again, in a broad bipartisan way, Congress reacted to that. The vast majority of us on this committee think that increasing Chinese use of mobile apps like TikTok, and while we have different approaches, I know the Vice Chairman and I very much believe that the TikTok poses a national security threat, both in terms of data collection and in terms of a potentially enormous propaganda tool. What I would like to hear from all of you, and maybe we'll start with Director Wray, but is do you share at least my assessment that national security has to be redefined in 2023 to recognize that domination of technology domains that on the surface do not appear to have anything to do with national security, artificial intelligence, Director Haines mentioned biotechnology, quantum computing, who wins the challenge around advanced energy. These are national security issues as well, and we have to do a better job of both convincing the public and, quite honestly, some in the business community. We've made progress on the business community, but many are still, as Senator Rubio made mention, inexorably tied to a global supply chain that relies on cheap Chinese goods. How do we make that case? But do you start with accepting the premise that national security has to include who wins each of these technology domains? And I'll just go right down the line.
Well, certainly, Mr. Chairman, I wholeheartedly agree that technology and economic security have become inextricably intertwined with national security, and the efforts this committee has made and that a lot of us in the intelligence community have made to engage the private sector, I think, are essential to that, and we just have to keep doubling down on that. You could just look at, for example, on the cyber side, our critical infrastructure is in 85% of it or something is in the hands of the private sector. And if you look at our innovation, if you look at our PII, our personally identifiable information, the percentage is even higher. And if you look at what the Chinese are trying to steal, that's where it is. So we need to be working more and more closely with the business community to try to build resilience. I think there have been a lot of progress that's been made, but we need to make more.
General?
Chairman, I certainly agree on the statement with regards to the changing nature of power, and I think that's where the National Security Agency has always found itself in being able to hardwire to look for what's the next technology we should be chasing. Being able to leverage a workforce that is very, very heavily inculcated with science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But I think the big piece that at least I've learned over the past several years is the fact that it's all about partnerships. It's the partnerships that we have here in the IC. It's the partnerships with the public sector. It's the partnerships that we have to develop that will give us the competitive advantage as we look at this new changing character.
Director Haines?
Yeah, absolutely agree, obviously, with my colleagues. And I mean, I think one of the things that we have been learning in the intelligence community, exactly as General Nakasone indicated, is our work with the private sector in this space is particularly important. As you know, over my lifetime, I have seen increasingly the innovation of critical foundational technologies occurring in the context of the private sector, and our capacity to work with them to understand essentially what those innovations are and how we can help them protect themselves in this context is another aspect of this that has to be focused on and something we spend a lot of time on.
Director?
No, Mr. Chairman, I fully agree. I think the revolution in technology is not only the main arena for competition with the People's Republic of China, it's also the main determinant of our future as an intelligence service as well. As you know, we've undertaken a number of innovations over the last couple of years to strengthen our capacity on that revolution in technology. For the first time, appointing a chief technology officer, for the first time establishing a CIA-wide technology strategy, creating a new mission center focused largely on technology, and as my colleagues emphasized, building better partnerships, stronger partnerships with the private sector as well as with academia, creating a technology fellows program, because we have to be more flexible in our employment practices as well to attract people who are accomplished in the private sector and the tech sector who may be interested in a couple of years of public service as well. And we're deeply interested in trying to attract those kind of people as well. And then finally, I absolutely agree on the importance of partnerships, not just across the intelligence community, but with others in the executive branch. So as you know, we're working closely with the Department of Commerce and their CHIPS Implementation Act office as well to provide the kind of direct support that I think is essential to that effort as well.
General.
Chairman, I completely agree with the statement. You went back to 1993. I'll go back to 1984. When I came in the Army in 1984, we own the technology. The West owned the technology. We won the Cold War, and then I think we took our eye off that ball. So now it's about how do we apply this asymmetric advantage that we have in this partnership of folks sitting at this table right now who work so closely together to try and defend our nation. Like the other agencies, DIA has hired the right people at the right time to get into this, to try and understand it and make an impact for the Department of Defense.
And I'm over time, but my only closing comment is that does mean we may need to redirect some of the resources. I mean, the idea of China's extraction of cobalt out of the DRC and how they're going to get it back to China becomes a national security issue. The question of China flooding the zone on standard-setting bodies to define the next technology rules for beyond 5G to kind of ORAN, Open Radio Access Networks, next generation wireless, is a national security concern. You know, who's leading the way on biotech innovation becomes a national security concern. And I think we need to make sure that we are both reporting on this and that we are engaging our private sector partners. I agree with Senator Rubio. Too many of our corporate world still believes that that these collaborations inside of China are benign, even though when they turn a blind eye to the literally unprecedented amounts of intellectual property theft, too often because they're making way too much money on investing in China tech. Some of that has changed, but this is an ongoing challenge. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. I'll start with you, Director Wray. Let me ask you, as I'm sure, I know you're familiar with this, the most downloaded app in the world, one of the most downloaded app in the world, is a social media company, TikTok. Could the Chinese government, through its ownership of ByteDance, that owns ByteDance US, if they wanted to, and ByteDance US were willing to cooperate or forced to cooperate, could they use TikTok to control data on millions of users?
Yes.
Could they use it to control the software on millions of devices, given the opportunity to do so?
Yes.
Could they use it to drive narratives, like to divide Americans against each other? Or, for example, let's say China wants to invade Taiwan, to make sure that Americans are seeing videos arguing why Taiwan belongs to China and why the U.S. should not intervene?
Yes, and I would make the point on that last one in particular that we're not sure that we would see many of the outward signs of it happening if it was happening. And I think the most fundamental piece that cuts across every one of those risks and threats that you mentioned that I think Americans need to understand is that something that's very sacred in our country, the difference between the private sector and the public sector, that's a line that is non-existent in the way the CCP operates.
Do you think it's valuable to look at how TikTok operates in China versus the U.S.? For example, in the U.S., kids are being encouraged to choke themselves out. We've had kids die in China. They're encouraged to focus on math and science and building the country. Is that an example of how two different versions of TikTok, one feeding our society poison and the other inculcating positive values, an example of how potentially or in reality TikTok could be used to damage our country?
I think those are among many sort of telling indicators that we should be looking at in assessing the national security concerns this poses.
So they can collect our data, manipulate information, poison the minds, and feed garbage into the minds of millions of people and so forth. Given the threat, I imagine this is the reason why TikTok is no longer allowed on federal devices pretty soon. No federal devices can have TikTok on it, correct?
Well, certainly at the FBI, TikTok never has been, and nor will it be approved. And I think it's my understanding that that's about to be in place across the entire federal government.
So given the weight of all this, does anyone in the panel disagree that TikTok is not a good thing for America? Well, if no one disagrees, my question is then, if TikTok is bad for America, and we've talked about all these disadvantages and potential harm that's caused by it, should the fact that it is popular among people under the age of 35 be the reason why we don't take strong action against it?
But not from my perspective.
Because that's what the Secretary of Commerce said is, that potentially we want to do something about this because it would upset people under the age of 35. So I guess my point, just tie it all up, is this is a substantial national security threat for the country of a kind that we didn't face in the past. So we're still, it's at the end of the day, it's not about some grown man in the middle of the day putting up videos, that people that have a job shouldn't be putting up. But it's also about all these other things that we've talked about, the data, the ability to manipulate information. I would imagine that it's probably one of the most valuable surveillance tools on the planet. I mean, if we went out and decided to build something like this of our own to influence or spy on another society, I'm not sure we could build something like this, or even better. And we've invited them in and protected them by our laws. So I don't understand why this company is allowed to operate as long as it's owned. It's my understanding, and maybe Director Haines, you can clarify this, but I think this is the case. Under Chinese law, any company, okay, what the company is in China, that the Chinese government says, give me everything you have, they have no choice but to give it to them, or someone else will be in charge, correct? Okay. My time is remaining here. I want to talk a little bit about COVID and the pandemic. So here's what we know about COVID, okay? It originated in the city of Wuhan, where the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has a questionable safety record and conducts experiments on making viruses that are not infectious in humans infectious in humans. They do it for the purpose of then developing a vaccine. They're located in that city. The Chinese CDC is also located in the city. Number two, unlike, for example, SARS, to this moment, unless it happened in the last hour, the Chinese have not been able to say, here's the bat, here's the pangolin, here's the animal that the virus came from. Number three, there is evidence, both in open source and I mean, it's been widely discussed that the Chinese, at a minimum, have not been, to say the least, open about any of this. And in fact, real clear indications that they've done everything possible to obstruct any sort of international inquiry into how this began or to be sharing this information. This is a lot of circumstantial evidence that adds together. And I believe that's why the FBI has concluded what on the origins of COVID, Director Wray?
So, Mr. Vice Chairman, as the committee knows, the FBI has long assessed, going all the way back to the summer of 2021, that the origin of the pandemic was likely a lab incident in Wuhan.
So, Director Haines, I know that there's a difference of opinion among the different agencies. I think Energy and FBI have that assessment. Are we unable to, what is preventing the other agencies from reaching the same assessment? Is it basically the lack of a smoking gun? Will we not be able to say that we believe that the lab origin is the likeliest outcome unless somehow we can provide a smoking gun proof that that's what happened?
Thank you, sir. So you're right. There's a broad consensus in the intelligence community that the outbreak is not the result of a bioweapon or genetic engineering. What there isn't a consensus on is whether or not it's a lab leak, essentially as Director Wray indicated, or natural exposure to an infected animal. Those are the two operating sort of theories. And what would change, essentially elements, perspectives, be additional information, and we've been trying to collect additional information. And I think you're absolutely right that China has not fully cooperated, and we do think that's a key critical gap that would help us to understand what exactly happened.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out that it is true that the lab leak, we don't have a smoking gun. Like we don't have some guy calling another guy saying, hey, we had a lab leak. We also don't have a smoking gun that it was a naturally occurring event, which is the easiest one for them to prove. Come out, have a press conference, show us the bat or the pangolin, whatever a pangolin is, and show us that this is the one and here's the virus that came from that animal. Because it would have not just been found in one animal, it would have been pretty widespread. That's the easiest thing for the Chinese to have done, and they haven't done it. I think that's a pretty strong reason to suspect that it's not naturally occurring, because they've done it with the other pandemics. Thank you.
And I would just point out, before I go to Senator Wyden, when those of us raise the issue around TikTok, it is not simply an American concern. Canada, the EU, India have also taken action on this application because of its national security concerns. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service. Begin with you, Director Burns. Last year, you committed to me that the CIA would require written justifications that could be audited whenever CIA conducts searches of its databases for information on Americans. Has the agency done that?
Yes, sir, we have, and thank you very much for your attention on this issue. In keeping with the commitment that I made to you last year, the CIA has made substantial and rapid progress developing and implementing across all of the CIA a capability to support written auditable justifications for searches, as you said, designed to retrieve U.S. person information. We've kept your staff regularly updated on this. We're ahead of the schedule that I set out for you in that letter last September. We've already begun implementing the tool we've developed in the database that the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board has been focused on, and now we're moving forward with that across the remaining databases.
Thank you for doing this. Let me turn to commercial information. Director Wray, does the FBI purchase U.S. phone geolocation information?
So to my knowledge, we do not currently purchase commercial database information that includes location data derived from internet advertising. I understand that we previously, as in the past, purchased some such information for a specific national security pilot project, but that's not been active for some time. I could provide more information about that in closed session if you would like. But when we use so-called ad tech location data, it is through a court-authorized process.
And you do not plan to change your current practice of not buying this geolocation information?
We have no plans to change that at the current time.
I think it's important, a very important privacy issue that not take place. So we'll discuss it more at the closed session. Director Haines, you convened an outside panel to study and make recommendations related to the government's purchase of data, including sensitive data on Americans. There has been a lengthy report that has been done here. Will you agree to release this report to the public?
Thank you, Senator. I'll absolutely, we'll have our folks review it for that purpose.
Is there any reason why it shouldn't be made available to the public?
No, I think it absolutely should, as long as there's not classified information in it, we'll provide it.
One additional question for you, if I might, Director Haines. As you know, last May, Senator Moran and I urged the President to prioritize the rewriting of the executive order that governs classification and declassification. It hadn't been updated in ages. In August, you wrote back on behalf of the President saying that the process was underway. My concern is that we're not seeing the urgency that is necessary, because we all know what the challenge is, and that's foot dragging by some people who mean well, but they're just not on the program of reform. Will you push the National Security Council to get this done? Because my sense is this just isn't going to happen unless you can successfully push the National Security Council to break up the status quo. Because the classification system is now at the point where, as you correctly said, and to your credit, it's not serving national security, and I think it's so broken, we're not getting classified what we need to get classified, and we surely are classifying stuff that shouldn't be classified. So we got to break up, business as usual here. And it's only going to happen, to me, in my view, if you can push the National Security Council. Can you commit to doing that?
Thank you, Senator. First of all, for your and for Senator Moran's attention on this issue, I think it is incredibly important and something that over many years, I think for all of us, we've seen the frustration of actually trying to make this better. I know the President is committed to this issue. I absolutely will ensure that he and the National Security Council know of your concerns and relay them as such.
I want to also ask you, Madam Director, about security clearances and past marijuana use. At the end of 2021, you issued guidance that past marijuana use was not by itself a disqualification for security clearance. I think it'd be very good if you could tell the American people why it's important that this past use not be a disqualification to serve your country. This is a national security issue, and we desperately need people. We've got new members in this committee. We've been talking about languages that they're going. to be focused on as we try to recruit and the like. Tell the American people why past marijuana use is not disqualifying for the national security post.
Thank you, Senator. I think we recognize, frankly, that many states have legalized or decriminalized marijuana use, and wanted to be sure that, you know, we're not disqualifying people solely for that purpose in that context. We obviously, you know, believe that we want to have the talent that exists in America, and, you know, when somebody is using it experimentally in a legal state, that's, you know, something that shouldn't on its own essentially disqualify. We continue to approach this from a whole of person perspective, and, you know, we expect if anybody takes the job to comply with our policies and our laws in a trusted position.
My time is up. I only want to say that I know we've got some big privacy issues ahead of us, and I want to thank all of you for keeping your door open to discuss them with me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haines, I want to follow up on the Vice Chairman's questions to you and the panel about the origins of COVID. We know that 6.5 million people have died, that trillions of dollars have been lost in economic activity. We also know that had we known early the origin of COVID, we might have been able to change the trajectory and been better prepared for future pandemics. So this matters. It is disturbing to me that in your written statement, you say all agencies assess that two hypotheses are plausible explanations for the origin of COVID: natural exposure to an infected animal and a laboratory-associated incident. That's one of those statements that's technically true, but misleading. We've heard the FBI director today say that the most likely explanation is a laboratory incident. We know that the Wuhan whistleblower who first raised alarms was silenced by the Chinese government and later died of COVID. We know, as your statement says, that Beijing continues to hinder the global investigation, resists sharing information, and blames other countries. Those are not the actions of an innocent party. We know that the Department of Energy has changed its assessment to say that most likely cause is a laboratory incident. I just don't understand why you continue to maintain on behalf of the intelligence community that these are two equally plausible explanations. They simply are not.
Thank you, Senator. And I think I share your frustration with the fact that China hasn't been more cooperative on this issue to provide intelligence that would be of use to the scientists and others who work on these questions. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right. This is critically important. It has been extremely challenging. Let me give you where we are in the intelligence community with more precision to your point. There are 4 elements plus our National Intelligence Council that assess with low confidence that the infection was most likely caused by natural exposure to an infected animal. So the IC remains divided on this issue. We have the FBI, as you noted, that sees it as more likely that it's a lab leak and has done that with moderate confidence. And the Department of Energy has changed its view slightly with low confidence. It says that a lab leak is most likely, but they do so for different reasons than the FBI does, and their assessments are not identical. So you can see how challenging this has been across the community, and not even every element of the IC has been able to put themselves on one side of the ledger or the other. I've given you, essentially 7, but not everybody has been able to put themselves on one versus the other. So it is a really challenging issue, and I think our folks honestly are trying to do the best that they can to figure out what exactly happened based on the information they have available to them.
Let me switch to a different issue. General Berrier, In the administration's hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan by an arbitrary date, billions of dollars worth of military assets were left behind, including munitions, 16,000 pairs of night vision goggles, 167 aircraft, communications equipment, 2,000 vehicles. The list goes on and on and on. My concern is that all of these assets could be useful in launching a terrorist attack on the United States or on one of our allies. Given the continued chaos in Afghanistan and presence of terrorist groups that want to harm the United States, that have made no secret about harming us or our allies, what is the intelligence community's assessment on the counterterrorism threat to the United States homeland and our allies, particularly one launched from Afghanistan?
Senator Collins, thank you for that question. From our perspective at the Defense Intelligence Agency, certainly our reach and grasp into that nation since the fall of the government has eroded over time, but we still have some access, and I would say, based on what we know right now from the threat of Al-Qaeda, they're trying to survive, basically without a real plan to at least, or intent to attack the West anytime soon. And I would say that ISIS-K poses a bit of a larger threat, but they are under attack from the Taliban regime right now, and it's a matter of time before they may have the ability and intent to actually attack the West at this point.
General Nakasone, very quickly, could you give me your assessment?
Yes, that dovetails very closely with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We see the same challenges across the IC with some of our collection, but we do see a challenged ISIS-K in Afghanistan right now as they battle the Taliban.
Thank you.
Senator Hynek.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Burns, U.S. law states that to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, a group must be engaged in premeditated, politically motivated violence against non-combatant targets, and the activity must threaten the national security of the United States. In my view, and in the view of a number of folks, the Wagner Group fits that definition. Wagner now openly operates as private military for Vladimir Putin, conducting terrorist operations in Ukraine and in countries across Africa. Director, I realize that the responsibility for designating foreign terrorist organizations lies with the Secretary of State, but I'd like to get your assessment of the Wagner Group's activities, whether you would describe the atrocities its mercenaries have committed as terrorism, and if you think there is any downside to making such a designation.
Well, thanks, Senator. And, you know, as you rightly pointed out, I'll steer away from the policy question there, but certainly our assessment is that the Wagner Group is a vicious, aggressive organization which has posed a threat not just to the people of Ukraine, and we see that every day, especially in the intense fighting that's gone around the city of Bakhmut right now, largely conducted on the Russian side by the Wagner Group, which is suffering incredible casualties. But I've also seen it, as we were discussing earlier, in my own travels in West Africa and the Sahel, where I think the deeply destabilizing impact of Wagner can be seen in a lot of very fragile societies right now. We work as an agency along with our partners to help many of those governments and many of our security service partners to resist that. We work with the French and with other countries, other allies in that effort as well. But we take very seriously the threat posed by Wagner and do everything we can to counter it and disrupt it.
Great. Thank you, Director. Director Haines, as you know, earlier I shared with you a report by the Converging Risks Lab called The Security Threat That Binds Us, which outlined, among other things, the need to elevate ecological security in U.S. national security policymaking. And one example they really go into a great deal of detail about is China's aggressive fishing activities and how those have contributed to overfishing more than any other nation. This has led to increasingly hostile fishing disputes between China and its neighbors, as well as along the coasts of Africa and Latin America, threatening economic, food security, and sovereignty. In the view of the report's authors, the IC needs greater capacity to analyze the negative effects of illegal fishing activities, as well as a whole host of other causes of ecological disruption. And it needs to elevate the relative importance of ecological security issues within the IC prioritization framework. Have you had a chance to look at that, and can you commit to work with me to try to implement some of the recommendations included in that report?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. No, I did see the report, and I thought it was actually excellent. We've given it to our National Intelligence Manager for Climate and Global Issues, who is focused on these issues. I think one of the things that it does say, very much in line with what you just indicated, is it's not just about collecting more analysts, it's about prioritizing it, it's about ensuring we have access to the outside folks. And I think that is something that we are trying to do, in other words, get expertise both from the federal science community and work with them, but also with academic communities and also with partners who have access to academic and other resources on these issues. And I absolutely commit to working with you further on this question. And I share your concern about unregulated, unlawful fishing that the Chinese have been doing in a variety of areas where we've seen them strip resources from, a variety of countries.
Thank you, Director. General Nakasone, I want to ask you one last quick question before my time is out, and it involves supply chains, which we are hearing a lot more about now for appropriate reasons. The 2021 National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change states that China is the world's leading supplier of advanced grid components for ultra-high voltage systems, things like transformers, circuit breakers, inverters, which we assess creates cyber vulnerability risks. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns about those vulnerabilities to our electric grid and what it means to currently be dependent on China for components for things like large power transformers?
Senator, you highlight the challenge of supply chains, and we know supply chains well, even from a different adversary with solar winds. What have we learned? I would tell you, first of all, is that as we are reliant on more and more nations to provide this type of capability, we have to have a vigilance in terms of how we look at this, whether or not we're understanding the complete supply chain of the critical pieces that come into it, or whether or not we have censoring on the other end that tells us something is anomalous, something is unique, something that has changed. This is the world in which we live. This is the world in which we have to operate for the future.
Would it be a good idea to try to produce some of those critical components here or with trusted allies and friends instead of being so dependent?
Certainly, and I think the work of many of you on this committee with regards to semiconductors is one great example of the importance of fabrication within the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, General.
Senator Cotton.
I want to raise a question that Senator Warner raised in his opening statement about the classified documents that were found at the residences or offices of President Trump, President Biden, and Vice President Pence. I want to be clear, I'm not talking about who done it, about who took them there and how they handled them and what criminal standards there are in their investigation, about the documents themselves and what risk, if any, they pose to our national security. Director Haines, the last time you appeared in front of this committee, you said that you had not personally reviewed those documents. Is that still the case?
I've only reviewed documents that have already gone through an initial classification review process. So now I have reviewed some of the documents, but not all of the documents. Myself, that is. There are others, obviously, within our institutions that have reviewed them.
Director Wray, have you reviewed these documents personally?
I have reviewed some of the documents personally, and my team, of course, has reviewed the documents.
Why have you not, to both of you, why have you not reviewed all of these documents? It would seem this would be a matter of vital urgency to put your eyes on these documents and make a determination if you think there actually is national security risk in the contents of those documents.
Thank you, Senator. I'll start and Director Wray can continue. But so when we get documents that have been compromised in the context of leak investigation or other things like that, I don't personally review them generally, even when they have significant consequences. There are the subject matter experts within the institutions that do that. They provide their views, and then they typically will summarize or otherwise indicate issues that have to be addressed as a consequence, if there are any.
Director Wray is the same answer.
Similar, except I would just add that we have teams of people who are experienced with these mishandling of classified documents cases, of which we have any number and have had for years. And I would add that although I have not reviewed all of the documents myself, I have gone through a fairly meticulous a listing of all the documents that includes detailed information about the content. So it's not reading every page of each one.
I bet General Nakasone and General Berrier, when they were second lieutenants, were taught that they were responsible for everything their organization does and fails to do, which I think is a pretty good principle of leadership. I just think on something of such prominence and perhaps such significance that you both should review them. More importantly, this committee should review them. And as you heard Senator Warner say, we're all very frustrated that we haven't even had these documents characterized to us. And we patiently allowed Senator Warner and Senator Rubio to try to resolve this matter, but I would say our patience is starting to run out. And at least some of us are prepared to start putting our foot down if we don't get better answers and the stonewall doesn't stop. Director Haines, I want to turn to a concern I've raised with you and Director Byrne and others, and that's my worries about growing politicization and the analysis coming out of our intelligence agency. This is an annual threat assessment. There is an annual threat assessment, so let's look at it. On page 33, you write, transnational, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists continue to pose the most lethal threat to U.S. persons and interests. Are you serious? You seriously think that racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists are the most lethal threat that Americans face?
So, yes, sir. In terms of the number of people killed or wounded as a consequence.
How many people were killed by racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists in the United States last year?
I don't have the exact number for you right here, but I will get it for you.
How many people were killed by fentanyl in the United States last year?
As you know, it's over 100,000 for fentanyl. But
so isn't that a more lethal threat?
Absolutely, but it's not being compared against fentanyl in that statement. It's in the context of terrorist threat.
Okay, so on page 38, you write about governance challenges in Europe. You talk about populist parties taking advantage of inflation and high energy prices. You worry that public discontent, potentially including increased mass protests, could undermine backing from mainstream European governments while increasing support for populist and extreme parties. You also say it could undermine the quality of democracy. Well, how is this foreign intelligence? And who are these populist parties in Europe that we're so concerned about?
So we can get you further information about this, but I'll just say as a general matter, Senator, we do cover different effects on democracy throughout the world, and that is something that is typically perceived as part of our remit.
Are the Brothers of Italy, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's party, are they a populist or extreme party that are a threat to America's interests?
I don't know that, I wouldn't want to speak for the analysts as to whether or not they consider them a populist party. I suspect that they may, but I don't know that they would say that they're a threat to to the United States.
All right, just one final example of this. On page 18 about nuclear issues with Iran, you write that since the assassination in November 2020 of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran has accelerated the expansion of its nuclear program. It's an unfortunate ending for Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in November of 2020. Did anything else happen in the world in November of 2020 that might have caused Iran to accelerate its nuclear program?
Senator, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Pretty big event here in America. November 2020.
If you mean the election,
No, I do mean the
I
election.
don't believe that our analysts perceive that as being the key.
Really, because I've gone through the IAEA reports. Iran took almost a year after President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal until the summer of 2019 to say it was going to incrementally begin to breach its limits. After we killed Qasem Soleimani in January 2020, they basically ceased all enrichment or other activity. And since November of 2020, they've reintroduced advanced centrifuges. They began enriching uranium past the critical 3.67% mark. They produce uranium metal. They've moved enrichment underground. They're now enriching to almost 90%. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Colin Call said to the House recently that they're just 12 days away from a breakout, implying that all happened on the former administration's watch. This has all happened since November of 2020, Director Haines. And your report says nothing about the Biden administration's policies. You really don't think the Ayatollahs had any change of views once it was clear Joe Biden was going to be president?
I think our analysts would look at leaving the JCPOA as one element that's relevant to the,
All right, so my time has expired.
ultimately
I'll say,
has
Director
happened.
Burns, we've talked about this in a classified setting before. I mean, your organization produces the vast majority of the analysis for the IC, and it's not just the conclusions, but also the priorities and the volume of focus on things like climate change or gay marriage bills in other countries, or some of these conclusions that just cause me great pause about the priorities and the resources we're applying to the critical threats this country face. We talk more about it in a classified setting.
Okay, thank you. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Director Haines, the good news is the report is clearly written and I think establishes a lot of very valuable information. The bad news is I made the mistake of reading it Monday night just before trying to go to sleep. There's a lot of serious matters in there. One of the things that really jumped out at me, and I want to follow up on Senator Heinrich's question, is on page, let's see, it's on page 9. China now is on track to control 65% of lithium-ion battery market. They dominate all parts of the supply chain, 40% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients, and their global share across all manufacturing of solar panels is 80% now, certainly go to 90%. This is an important information for us in terms of informing us about the dangerous dependency that we've developed in a whole lot of areas. And semiconductors is one that we've talked about, but it suggests to me that this issue of dependency is something that really has to have some serious policy examination. Would you concur?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that we're really trying to expose here is the fact that it's not just simply about China trying to create indigenous supply chains, but actually to control global supply chains.
That seems to be a deliberate policy, does it not?
Exactly.
And that goes also about their actions in Africa and other South America, where they're trying to corner the market, if you will, on various commodities.
And you can see it also, as you indicate, not only in their decisions about what they're purchasing and how they're managing it, but also the laws that they pass that give them the capability, for example, in rare earth elements, to actually turn the dial on their export and import policies so that they can actually create that pressure.
You'd think that we'd learn from Europe's dependency on Russia and gas that this is a similar thing that we really need to address as a matter of policy. Move to another specific intelligence question. What's the current analysis on the relationship between China and Russia? Is it a temporary marriage of convenience, or is it a long-term love affair?
It is continuing to deepen. So I think maybe the latter, although I hesitate to characterize it as a love affair. But so there are some limitations that we would see on where they would go in that partnership. We don't see them becoming kind of allies the way we are with allies in NATO, but nevertheless, we do see increasing across every sector.
Well, the sector that we're most concerned about right now is aid to Russia in the Ukraine conflict. What do we see there? Is China about to act? Are they issuing any supplies now? That's the highest risk, it seems to me, in terms of the development of this relationship, right? The immediate risk.
Yeah, we do see them providing assistance to Russia in the context of the conflict. And we see them in a situation in which they become increasingly uncomfortable about the level of assistance and not looking to do it as publicly as might otherwise occur, and given the reputational costs associated with it. But I think that is a very real concern, and the degree of how close they get and how much assistance they're providing is something we watch very carefully, and we'd be happy to talk to you about that in closed session.
One point I thought you could have used more emphasis. There's a whole section on climate change, which is, interestingly, it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, climate change. in terms of risks. And you identify the risk of famine and food insecurity across the developing world. You mentioned migration 2 or 3 times, but that, it seems to me, is one of the most serious destabilization risks. The Syrian refugees upset European politics 6 million. We're talking 100+ million. I hope that the intelligence community can provide some more detailed analysis of the migration risk, which I see as one of the real challenges of the next 10 or 15 years as it becomes uninhabitable in areas of North Africa and the Middle East. Could you comment on that?
Could not agree with you more, sir, and we will look to try to produce something, and perhaps we can do something publicly along those lines.
And General Nakasone, in a few seconds that I have left, China's cyber posture, my sense is that they're getting more aggressive. Is that true, and is Russia adapting and getting better?
Senator, I would say that both for China and Russia, they are very capable cyber adversaries. With regards to China, we see an increasing degree of risk-taking that they've undergone with regards to stealing our intellectual property, even increasing their influence operations. These are concerning efforts for us. With regards to Russia, we still see them, and we see them very accurately and being able to warn and being able to counteract some of the things that they're doing around the world. And so we know them very, very well.
But they're getting cleverer, aren't they, about using our infrastructure, for example?
Well, certainly they're getting clever, but we still, I would say, Senator, are able to stay ahead of them. And that's the big piece that I want to emphasize.
Maybe the answer would be, so are we getting more clever. Thank you.
Well said, Senator.
Thank you.